Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. I would love
Yeah,
if you
thank
could
you.
start by giving us some context for who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Michael, as you said. I use he and they pronouns. I am currently a psychotherapist, trauma therapist, and social worker based in Nashville, Tennessee. However, I was born and raised into a missionary and pastor's family in Central Europe. And so that's where I grew up the first 16 years of my life and where my parents still live and where I still consider partially my home. Home is
Mhm.
complicated. We'll talk about that later, but
Yeah.
partially my home is there. And yeah, so I am full-time therapy now. I've been practicing as a social worker since 2019.
Okay.
And yeah, it's kind of a very basic summary of who
Yeah.
I am.
That's awesome. So I'm curious about, growing up in Central Europe. What was that like? What was your faith experience like there? Your parents were missionaries, right? What was that
Mhm.
like?
Yeah, so my parents are evangelical missionaries. Non-denominational is probably the best way to describe it. Um, However, we did work with the Baptists in Europe, even though that's not technically the words we would have used to describe ourselves at the time. And yeah, my parents moved there before I was born with my two older siblings. And it was a home that was very focused on faith. Everything we did was because of faith and centralized in faith,
Mhm.
and really in many, many beautiful ways. A lot of intentionality on how they lived their life. And then
Mhm.
also in some really complicating ways for me, at least, as I came to know myself better and my own, specifically my sexual orientation, it became, yeah, there were some ways that that world just wasn't set up for someone like me. And yeah, so it really was a wonderful childhood. I'm beyond grateful for my parents that they raised me there. Something they did incredibly well is that they, even though we knew we were Americans, we were pretending we weren't.
Mhm.
They really integrated us into the culture, into the people there. And so my upbringing really was, especially for the first couple of years of my life, was very Austrian. Like went to Austrian public school, wasn't super apart, separated like some other missionaries that I've met who kind
Mhm.
of just hang out with the Americans and then kind of do work with people from the country. They really did a good job around that. And yeah, that's something I'm really grateful for. So I'm a third culture kid is the language we use, but I also even more so am almost bicultural is how I think about it. There's something about kind of the familiarity with the culture there that is just part of who I am. And yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. So what are you curious about? I know there's a lot there. I don't know where to start.
I mean, first of all, it's so amazing. So I too am a TCK, third culture kid, not because of missionary parents, but military family. So
Uh-huh.
I
Uh-huh.
spent a lot of my, like all of middle school and high school in England.
Okay.
So I can certainly identify with that sense of being in the other world. Although I was one of those people, right? We had our own little America, military
Mm-hmm.
base. So, but I wonder, especially being immersed in the Austrian culture, how did that change your experience of Christianity? I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
know your parents were the missionaries, right? They were sort of bringing their version of Christianity. But was there a sense in which the Austrian culture shaped the Christianity in different ways?
Interesting. Yeah. So the Austrians as a whole, especially in Vienna, very cosmopolitan area, was a lot more skeptic, a lot more postmodern, and I framing it that way, I think could would connect with a little bit how I view faith is a little bit more skeptical. I think I've always been a little bit more skeptical if I'm really, really honest with myself. So in some ways, there's that just because Europe is a burnt out church state. Like the Catholic Church had a hold on power and state power for so long that I think people are very, very trepidatious when it comes to anything having to do with religion, anything that feels confining to them and restrictive to them.
Mm.
And so in terms of pure Austrian culture, I think that's how it is. Then when I got older, I found myself in very international circles because Vienna became more and more international and globalized. And so my friend group at one point was mostly Filipinos, South Koreans, Nigerians, and Costa Ricans. Like it was a very, very international experience. And so at that point, I was still in Vienna, still felt Austrian, but my experience was very, very broad and multicultural in that sense.
Mm.
And I would say that even more so, that that type of diversity, the the love for culture in terms of like artistic expression and just a fascination and curiosity with culture and how people express themselves and understand themselves, that really stayed with me and translated into my faith in my life, and then later on, especially in my life, where I would just be so fascinated by different expressions of Christianity and eventually different expressions of faithfulness and spirituality in general. But I would say that multicultural component really has been stayed with me. Like I feel most comfortable around international people, even though we may not be from the same area. I feel closest to other immigrants and third culture kids because we have this joint sense of understanding the world in a very different way, in a very nuanced way, in a way where we're this idea of culture being almost like the air we breathe, right? And if you don't think about it for monocultural people, it's just kind of, you don't think about the air we breathe, right? But for third culture kids, we had to be aware of how we're breathing, what air we're breathing at what times. And so it's almost like we have these glasses on that show us the air all around us, the culture all around us. And so there's a way that we're able to engage with culture that I think is a little bit different and a little bit more aware in a way that I'm really appreciative. And I think faith wise, that has really, that curiosity, like I said, has been like, oh, I wonder how culture has impacted this expression of faith for this person, right? And even looking at it for my family and my extended family who didn't grow up in Europe, and being able to see how has culture actually impacted it, and being non-judgmental around that, just being curious around, okay, what is this interplay between culture and faith, and why is faith to look the way it does?
Mm-hmm. I love that, a curiosity around it rather than a judgment. I mean, I feel like for me, it was easy for me to develop a judgment around it, to see like recognizing the way that culture was playing out in, my family's faith and that sort of thing. So I wonder, how did that fit in with, the work you saw your parents doing?
Mm-hmm. And I will say, right, I think now that I've grown and healed a lot from my upbringing in my own work as a trauma therapist. I've yet to meet a trauma therapist that has not been through trauma themselves, which is why they're in the field. So yeah, there's definitely a certain amount of work I've had to do. Yeah, definitely there was judgment and still is at times when I look at the world around me, especially here in the States, where I'm just, especially being in the South too, where I'm just like, oh, if y'all could just see, just there are things impacting each other here, that are in relationship here that you're just not seeing. But in terms of how my parents did the work, I mean, like I said, I really appreciated how they raised me in many ways. My parents were very intentional about their beliefs. They were very intellectual about it. So there was a lot of dogma, there was a lot of theology, there was a lot of thought behind it, but also a willingness to question in some ways, at least a willingness to engage in the questioning process, I would say, of, okay, let me critically look at how faith is impacting culture. And my parents have developed even further beyond that in ways that I'm like, oh, this is super cool that you're asking these questions in different ways. And I think throughout time, it started more just kind of as the faith that I kind of see here, and more really into a outward expression of faith, more the praxis of it is what I saw it developing into for them. So when I was in middle school, one of the most impactful moments for my upbringing, looking back, is my mom started an organization working with survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking. And so it wasn't abnormal for us to be housing someone who was in the industry, who was needing emergency shelter for a couple nights or a couple weeks. And so I developed these relationships with these people these sex workers, these prostitutes, these people who were trafficked, who, yeah, I otherwise would have never met. And we developed these really close family relationships with them. And people that when I go back and visit home, I still go to see them, right? Even though we're from very different worlds. And this more starting to lean into this justice perspective of like, oh, there's a praxis to faith that is beyond just being good Christians, but there is a praxis to it that is very interactive and relational with the world around it in ways that, oh, okay, there are societal things here that are at play. And so that really started, I think, the way I thought about it. And looking back, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense given my faith now, that is very much around praxis, sometimes to the chagrin of how I was raised. Being able to focus, okay, how are people interacting with their environment, and how is that a reflection of their faith? And that really stuck with me. And that's something my parents have done well and did a good job raising me with. And in a way I'm really, really grateful for. Of course, there are blind spots there. I believe there are blind spots there, specifically around gender and sexuality. And at the same time, it also does translate into a certain level of compassion too.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I hear and what you're saying is a lot of nuance, right? To be able to hold the both end of like, there were really amazing things and there were things that were missed, right? There were things that weren't in the awareness that was being held.
And of course there was, yeah.
Right. I mean, for everyone, right? Yeah. But I wonder, how did you navigate that you mentioned, your own sexuality sort of coming up against your faith. How did that play out? Were you aware of your sexual orientation and gender identity at the time? Yeah.
That's a good question. I think in many intuitive body-based ways I was. There was this wisdom to my bodily intuition as a kid that looking back, I was like, okay, that's what was happening there. And I was also, whether or not this was the intention of what I received, essentially what was communicated to me in the theology I felt like was this very, very simplified, the spirit is good and the flesh is evil. And so I learned, as one of my friends recently, I was in conversations with him and he said something that just like opened my eyes. I was like, oh my gosh, that is me. That's what happened to me. He said that the less I trusted my body, the safer I felt. And because if I trusted my body, it would lead me into sin. It would lead me into disconnection with God because my body was evil, unless it's within the certain context. But even then, right, we still are inherently evil and sinful. And if we let it take the reins, we will be gluttonous and sinful and all these blah, 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 blah things around it. And so I learned, just because faith was important to me, I learned to disconnect from my body completely. And so even now I'm starting to recognize that maybe, I have a really hard time following my hunger cues. That's just something I've always really struggled with. I've always really struggled with being able to nourish myself at the right time or know how much I need. Sometimes I overeat, sometimes I undereat, or don't even cook and I just work all day. And then I realize at 10 p.m., like, why am I hangry? Oh, it's because I haven't eaten all day. That's why. But I'm starting to make connections in my own work, saying, okay, this had consequences. Me disconnecting from my body had consequences for me in how my body functioned my
Yeah.
digestive system, even like even as tangible and physical as that, that even though I can't prove one to one that's what's happening, I do know I was completely disconnected from my experience. And so I have very tangible memories as a teenager having a dream, a sex dream, and feeling so much shame and actively working to dissociate myself.
Mhm.
And that kind of carried. And so I wasn't really aware of, because of that, I really was in denial and repression around that. So in many ways, I didn't even pay attention to it. And it was silent enough. I was able to manage it enough that it was silent. I didn't have to pay attention to it until I got to college. And then in college, I started my mental health, just started breaking down, started struggling with depression and anxiety on a whole new level, started going to really dark places. I was also a classical musician at the time, studying music, and music was one of the few things that was consistent for me growing up, just because we did move, and in the discomfort of having to come back to the States every 4 years for 6 months, and like leaving people all the time. Music was really the thing that I excelled at and that I found comfort in. So then going to college, starting to study music, all of the joy of that fell away, and it just became this very mechanical
Mm.
thing. And I think those my relationship with music and the arts is very integrated with my relationship with faith too, and my mental health. They're all kind of in one pot. And yeah, my body started revolting against me and said, hey, you're going to pay attention now. If you're not going to pay attention to hunger cues, you're going to pay attention to you feeling miserable 24/7.
Mhm.
And that's when I first sought help, from a therapist at the counseling center, and really opened up and leaned into the community I had at the time, which was the community I do believe I needed at the time. Still very much faith focused, and that was good. It was a resource for me. And simultaneously, when I started asking those deeper questions of I was very, very smart with my therapist, because I did not trust secular therapists, and I was taught not to trust secular therapists. And I knew that she would ask about my romantic life, and I knew how to navigate avoiding even that conversation in my therapy with her. And so there was a moment where she outsmarted me in some ways and asked a question I wasn't expecting. Whether that was intentional or not, I'll never know. But she asked a question around, Michael, who are you attracted to? And I was just like, who? And I completely dissociated, I'm pretty sure. I don't really have any recollection of the rest of the session. And I withdrew from therapy after
Mm.
that. And so that moment, looking back, was a moment where I was like, okay, rubber's meeting the road here. And I also went to a secular university where there was so much diversity, and this love for diversity that I have, this multicultural part of me, was loving getting to know all these people from different parts of life and different parts of the world, and their beliefs and I was just so fascinated and energized by the people around me, including a lot of folks from the queer community.
Mhm.
And those were really my first friends who were openly affirming of their sexuality and gender, some of them having grown up in faith traditions themselves. But I remember being very judgmental towards those people and being like, well, clearly they don't understand
Mhm.
Christianity and faith and scripture the way I do, and therefore they're actively in sin. And I did really believe that. But at the same time, I had some very, looking back, generous queer friends at the time that were like, we're just gonna ignore that part of you for your sake and still be in a relationship with you, because we're all aware of what's happening, even though you're not aware of what's happening right here. um yeah, so that just grew and developed throughout time. And um yeah, yeah, so that's kind of a long-winded way to talk about how it showed up, but that's kind of the thing that comes to mind going
Mm.
into college.
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean,
Oh yes.
what really is hitting me right now as I listen to you talk is the connection of body and mind, and
Mm,
maybe we could say spirit,
mhm,
like this sense of like who you were as a person of faith. And I think about like how music plays into that, like the crucial role of music and faith communities, right? Like I think those things are often intimately connected, but then how that shows up for you in terms of like depression and anxiety, in terms of dissociation. And like I feel like that's such a common experience for so many people who grew up with this kind of story, right? That we learn early on what it is to dissociate, right? Like, which is so sad, but it's the reality. And
It's to
then
maintain connection. Yeah.
right? Yeah. And there comes a point though where it's not sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. This is a story. I work a bunch with religious trauma in my practice. And I mean, people are so shocked when I tell them things that they're like, yeah, that's exactly what it is. I'm like, yeah, this is a well-oiled machine at this point. Like the church in certain contexts knows what to communicate so that they don't have to deal with the fact that there will be people in their congregation who are sexual and gender minorities, right? We're in every community, every society throughout all of time. We will always show up. We are like we are a pest in that way that it does not matter what you try to do. We will always show up again in our own families, in our own communities. We will show up, and that is not by our own choosing. It is just how the world works, and the beauty of it too.
Yeah. Right. And I think one of the really challenging things about being like a gender and sexual minority is oftentimes, most of the time, you're not born into a family of other gender and sexual minorities, right? Like your family may have other minority statuses, but oftentimes that status is not shared by your immediate context. And so you're forced to navigate the world feeling alone. And so I wonder, I mean, this is something I've thought about a little, not a lot, but I do wonder what kind of world can we build where that is different? Like, what would it look like to build a world that's informed about this reality that minority expression is often isolated? And so how can we, I mean, I think things are changing, right? We're seeing so much more representation in the media, for instance. And so, like little kids can be like, oh, I feel like that person too, or like that. But yeah.
At least in our context, right?
Right.
In the American context.
For sure.
That is definitely the case. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that piece of around community and feeling so lonely. So I kind of laugh at myself when people ask about my coming out journey, because I'm like, I've had every one of them. Like that's what it feels like. Because I started, right, complete repression, complete lead in denial. And then after this mental health spell early on in college, I moved into more ex-gay world where I said, hey, I do have this, and I can actively work and pray enough and do these things and read the Bible enough that it will go away. And I wasn't officially involved in any official like Exodus International conferences or any conversion therapy groups. However, I did have several people in my life where we would have conversations and I would be downloading Exodus International materials from their website. And even though I wasn't actively involved in Exodus, I was very familiar with their materials in that world. And so in that way, it was conversion. It was a conversion practice on my end, right? It was my own attempt at converting my own sexual orientation and reparative therapy. And so there was this engagement with it in that sense. And so at one point, I felt like I'd managed it. It was gone. I even told people, I'm like, I'm healed, and had this whole excitement about that. And then started dating a girl who was wonderful and is wonderful, and realized 6 months after, I was like, nope, this is not going to work out. And I'm so grateful that I was in tune enough with myself that I wasn't dissociating. And partially because I was worried for her. I was like, I don't want her to be in pain because of whatever happens to me. And I think that compassion piece was able to override maybe the level of dissociation that I could have experienced otherwise. Um, but yeah, I ended up breaking off with her, and I was like, I don't know what to do with this, right? And that's when I was introduced to what we consider in the queer theology community as side B, right? This idea that someone can be celibate and they can identify as gay and they can understand their sexuality as being attracted to the same people, same gender. And in some ways, that is a gift, right? It allows you to be available to do God's work as a single person. But in other ways, it's still inherently evil and bad and sinful. And any act upon or willingness to engage with the bodily experience of that queerness is still bad. And so that was that. You're hearing my biases a little bit around that. But that was the world I started in, and I have a lot of appreciation because it did tell me the beauty of singleness and the work that a lot of side B folks are doing. And I know side B folks who I really do believe are called to a life of celibacy, where really that is their vocational calling for themselves. And I think that's wonderful. And I've learned a lot from them and how we idolize marriage and how that's not even in a faith tradition wise, how that has evolved into the culture. We see this Americanized American dream version of it that we have now. And to it still, my body was still actively working against me in the sense that it was like, this is it. Like you're still not able to relate to people the way you need to. And I didn't have words for it then, but it's come more recently with me now, just because I do work around this topic quite a bit. But I think there's this is going to sound really funny, but I think there's a hypersexualization of sexual orientation and gender. And what I mean by that is there's a relational component to that is beyond just what genitals I like to be around, right? The fact that I, as a kid, as a 13-year-old boy, that I was able to have deep, intimate relationships with my female classmates, right? And even though I was the only boy in my entire school that would cross the gender line, right? The fact that because I believe is because of the way I'm wired to connect with people, right? The fact that I don't have potential of wanting to be intimate, physically intimate with someone, that's going to change how I relate to them. And that's going to allow for an intimacy to grow that wasn't there before. And so that what I started realizing was it wasn't just me needing to be abstinent. That was what this was asking, what celibacy was asking me to do. It wasn't just to be abstinent. It was asking me to cut off how I related to people, right? It's relationality. Sexuality is relationality. And if we say you can't relate to people in a certain way, that's neurobiologically how we're wired to connect and find safety and regulate our emotions. Like there are a lot of things that have to do with our ability to stay in community with people. And my sense is if a person knows, and I have no judgment for clients who decide they want to explore all different avenues of what that can look like. And I think that's great. And I also believe that the body knows. And that at the end of the day, that if they're so actively struggling that they cannot be present in their life the way they want to be, the body is telling them something. And so that is really what opened, once I became affirming of myself, found, kid you not, within 24 hours, a lot of my physical symptoms dissipated. The pain, the chronic pain I was experiencing, the depression, anxiety. And I'm not saying that's how it works for everyone. I'm saying for me, it just shows me how much I was holding on and how at the surface this pain and this tension was, that allowing myself to then become affirming in the context of my community, who I was very grateful had evolved to around this topic. My immediate friend group and the people around me had already become affirming in their own way. And so when I came out to them, there wasn't a threat of disconnection with them. And that is, if I didn't have that, it would have been a million times more hard, more difficult. But I found that once I let my body just breathe and I wasn't actively trying to like moralize how my body felt about things and just allow myself to be in my body.
Yeah.
And starting that relationship really from scratch,
Mm.
from whatever, probably my 7-year-old self that had to disconnect from the fact that he loved twirling in dresses in our costume box in our little cowgirl dress, that allowing myself to rekindle that relationship with my body again. And that's really been my journey, and it's been slow since then.
Yeah.
In some ways it's the healing journey. I'm like, all right, I have all this knowledge,
Right.
but the problem is I can't use the same tools that I used before. The tools I need to use is using my body
Yeah.
and in this more somatic experience of the world. And that is, I still, when I'm nervous and anxious, I go up into my head.
Mm.
Everything is cerebral, right? Everything is up here, intellectualized. I intellectualize my pain a lot. And
Mhm.
so the work I have to do with my therapist, and I laugh at this because every time they call me out on it, I'm just like, oh, why are you so right about this? Where they're like, your thinking self is popping in right now. And maybe you just need to be right now. And I'm like, you're right, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been a journey for sure. And so when people ask me for my coming out, it is difficult. And I came out to my larger community a couple years after that, to mixed reviews as to be expected. And but overall, I do feel that my relationships, even people that disagreed with me, well, not everyone, but some people who really disagreed with me, our relationship was strong enough to still be okay with being in community with each other in some way. And even though the relationship changed for sure, and we both understood that we weren't going to be our primary supports anymore because of this, or secondary, whatever, um, that we can still be like, we can still trust that the other person is on their own journey. And that was probably the most powerful thing. I had a friend who grew up in the South that I went to college with, and we were all part of the same Bible studies. And this wasn't part of his story at all, this gender sexuality piece, but very, very Southern, just naturally. And I remember talking to him on the phone and like feeling like I knew what he was going to say. And him just surprising me, being like, you know where I stand on this. He's like, but I also trust you in your faith and your relationship with God. So I'm going to take you at your word for that. And I remember being like walking on campus during grad school, being like, being so like the wind knocked out of me, being like, oh wow, okay, so there is a way to be in relationship still,
Mhm.
but it does require that trust, right, in me and in my faith and my journey,
Yeah.
which has to be a offering.
Yeah, it's a huge gift that somebody can do that. I mean, I come from a Southern context too, and that was not a gift I received from a lot of people. There was,
Mhm.
I mean, I remember there was this almost pity from a lot of
Yeah.
people when I came out, right? That I had lost connection with God, that I had
Mhm.
lost my way. That was the automatic assumption. And certainly not all people. Some people did offer me that gift of, you know, they knew me and they trusted me and they trusted that I was on my journey. And yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic to experience with people, and how people navigate you in a different way, right? When they learn something new, even though it's like, I'm still me, right? It's not like
Right.
we have changed.
Yes.
We changed the
Yeah.
way we relate to ourselves, right?
Uh-huh.
But yeah.
Indeed, indeed. And I laugh too, because I think all of us can have memories where like, I'm still me. Like, I
Mhm.
love musical theater
Right.
and danced in certain clothing. And like, I was always that kid.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so like, are we shocked? Like, is
Yeah.
anyone shocked
No,
when it came
right.
out? I was like, I hope the answer is no. And
Yeah.
that's not to say all these things equate this.
Right.
And at the same time, if one really knew me, I think one would not be surprised that I did come out as queer at
Yeah.
one point. Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, I often make a distinction, and when I think about coming out to people, it's like, I'll say something like, well, they had some shock in the moment, but they weren't surprised.
Ah, mhm,
Yeah. Like there's that initial, like, oh my God. And then it's like, well,
mhm.
okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing that I hear, I mean, I feel like we've been talking about this a lot, is body, right? The way that bodies get talked about in religious or faith spaces, the way that we learn to relate to our bodies in those spaces, especially conservative Christian contexts. And this past Sunday at church, we talked about embodied practices. We actually were in a circle and somebody led us in this like practice ritual that they do every morning. They call it the dragon dance, but it's sort of like, it's kind of yoga-esque. It's like, I think partly from like Celtic practices. And it's like just you're moving your body, you're like taking in like breaths and breathing out and, touching the ground and recognizing your connection to the earth. But it's very much like, I'm here, I'm a body, I exist, I can move, I can breathe. And I asked people at the end, like, what was that like, And people talked about joy and connecting to their body. And I asked, what do you usually feel when you come to church about your body? What does your body do in church? And a lot of people said, I just feel like my body is like a receptacle. I come and I sit in a pew and people feed me something and I leave.
A brain
Right?
transportation vehicle.
Yes, that's one of the other phrases. Someone said, my body is just a vehicle for my brain, it feels like. Yeah. And so this sense of embodiment, I mean, I think the American culture in some ways is very much a reaction to that lack of embodiment. And I think that is sometimes what creates our over sexualization of things, is because we weren't aware of our bodies. And so we're trying to find the balance there. Yeah. But I wonder, how did you, I mean, I imagine as a trauma therapist that you're doing a lot of work around body and connecting to body. You talked about your own work around your connection to your body. And I wonder, like, how did you sort of come to those conclusions? What was it that helped you recognize that you needed a connection with your body?
Oof, that's a great question. I don't know the exact moment, but I know some precipitating events. For one of my college internship type things, I ended up working with a nonprofit organization at the time that was focused on training people to use the arts in response to traumatic stress. And flew out to the West Coast where they were located, and for the summer. And my supervisor, the person that ended up being my supervisor for the intern project, and then I ended up working for them for a bit, she is still one of my absolute favorite people in the world. And she's also multicultural. Grew up in was born in Southeast Asia, but grew up in South Africa and then moved to the States. So like, right, this very conglomerate. Her relationship with her body was very different than mine, having just grown up in Western Central Europe and the United States, which was very, very Western in that sense. But she's a therapist as well. And I remember us leading these trainings and her doing body-based dance movement exercises. And the thing is, I was a dancer when I was in middle school. Like, I was part of a dance group, and I loved it. It was the only way that I felt like I could move my body in a way that wasn't like super competitive, in a way that I didn't automatically feel judged by other people. So I'm still trying to figure out like how my dissociation worked with my dance too, or if that was just like a reprieve for a moment, or how that worked together, because they definitely coexisted at the same time. But that being said, I remember us doing these body-based activities that felt so silly, right? And the idea of being playful as an adult is just, I mean, this is something I have to work on with my clients when they're not kids. It's just like, when was the last time you were playful? And there was so much resistance in me to participate in this activity that I was technically co-leading or observing. And there's so much resistance in me because it felt too risky. It felt too vulnerable. And then I did risk it. and it was fun. And I actually enjoyed myself, and I connected with the group in a new way. And but at the same time, with body awareness, as many folks who have some kind of dysphoria, specific in gender and body dysphoria, know that having an increased awareness of the body doesn't always feel good, right? It doesn't always bring joy.
Right.
And I had both of those feelings at the same time, of this like invigorated, I am connecting with people on a new level, and just that feeling I had around it of like, I have limbs and I have fingers and fingernails, and like, that's weird. And like feeling, yeah, just being hyper aware of my body in some ways that I think I needed to get to that willingness to be uncomfortable with my body before I could move forward.
Mm.
But I remember being held in that context so well, being able to connect with people and being able to name some of the discomfort I felt with my body in that space, and it being accepted and being like, yeah, many of us have different iterations of this, right? We don't have your experience, but we have different iterations of that experience. And that's kind of what led me, and that's where I developed the language around trauma, and trauma research, and I was doing research with them. So that's where really my intellectual, I have a stack of books right here that are just the trauma literature that I go back to back and forth around these things. And so that's really what set me on my path of ended up going to social work school to become a trauma therapist, and going that route. Then that's really what started it, was this really relational piece. And I would say I come and go as it relates with my relationship with my body. There are times where I'm doing a lot better with it, or I am much more in tune with my hunger cues, where I am like, I just started playing mandolin for the first time.
Mm.
And my teacher is an Irish mandolin player, and she teaches it only by teaching it orally.
Mm.
She doesn't give you sheet music, which as a classical musician, I'm like, I need sheet music because I need to know exactly what you expect of me so I can do it right. Right. But for her to be like, nope, you can just get a slow downer app, use the MP3, you'll figure it out. Trust your body. And I'm just like, but how can I trust my body? But like playing this mandolin for whatever reason is what's connecting me with my body right now. And we call it joyful movement in the trauma world. Joyful movement of some sort, being able to connect with your body in a way that feels good and feels embodied, but also not like it's pushing us in many ways. And for some people, that's working out in sports, and I think that's great. I know for me, the closest I'll get to that is like going on a hike. Going on a strenuous hike is probably as far as I can push my body before it starts to get to that point of starting to get panicky. And maybe that's my own work I need to continue. But yeah, playing mandolin right now is kind of where my embodied practice is. But before that, I had 6 months to a year where I realized I was completely dissociative in my head, that every time something challenging would happen, I would go into my head rather than going on a walk at the park 2 minutes from my house, or going to yoga or dancing in my car, doing a shoulder dance. And this is something I talked about to a client recently. I was like, all right, we're going to practice. They're very uncomfortable in their body. I was like, but do you have a favorite song right now? And they're like, yeah, it's this song. I was like, all right, I want you to dance to it. And they're like, what? And I was like, yeah, I want you to dance to it. And they're like, I'm not going to do that. I was like, all right, can you dance to it in your car by yourself? And they're like, okay, maybe a little bit. I was like, all right, we can just start with the shoulders, right? And so it's me and this client in the room, just like doing a shoulder dance, like pretending we have a steering wheel. And I was like, we're gonna practice this together, so you get the weirdness feeling out of it, so that when you get in your car after this, you're able to turn on that song and just do a shoulder dance right now, right? And it comes and goes, my awareness of it, and then I intellectualize the body piece, and then I have to be sucked back into it. So yeah, that being said, it is an ever-growing journey and relationship, like any relationship is.
Yeah. I love thinking about it as not such a like binary, like I'm in touch or I'm not in touch with my body, but a recognition that at one point you were not very in touch, and now you're moving towards that work of getting in touch, right? That it's an ongoing process. And I think for me, even that's helpful to hear, like this reminder And I also wonder, how much of that binary thinking comes from our faith tradition of like, you're in sin or you're not in sin, you're right with God or you're not right with God, right? This constant, I mean, for me, I notice like a lot of self-policing around this, like I'm right or I'm wrong, I'm in or I'm not, And so finding that space for spectrum and growth and compassion
And
and
relationship. Yeah.
yes, relationship, right? And relationship takes time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It took me, I'm 28 now. It's like it took me 27 years to get to a point where I am even aware when dissociation is happening in my body. Right. And I've done a lot of work since then, but it's like probably about 7, no, not quite 7. I'd say about 6 years of really intense work of me being aware of where I am now. It's going to take more than a year for me to develop the relationship with my body that I hope to have one day.
Yeah. And could you define dissociation? So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, I mean, in my experience, so I don't know if Amy told you, I'm in a mental health counseling program right now
Oh,
myself.
awesome. Cool.
I just took a trauma class in the fall, life-changing, but it was an elective class. It's like
Don't get
I
me
would
started on that.
never
Yeah.
like this is like knowledge that should be widely held. But anyways, could you just say like how would you explain dissociation?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that in. Dissociation, the way I understand it, is a disconnection from the self. And that sounds very therapeutic. So let me break it down even more. As I said it out loud, I was like, all right, this is some Freudian stuff happening right now. What I mean by that is when we experience really, really difficult things, chronic stress, our minds and our bodies don't know how to process it. And so the only way we know how to is to cut that part off from ourselves and push it away. And it still has the same amount of energy though, right? And so even though it's disconnected from our adaptive networks of how we're able to process through things, it still has all this energy. And so dissociation is the fragmentation of our own experience, where we say when we start to get overwhelmed or stressed, that we say it's easier not to be in pain, so I'm going to disconnect from that part of me, right? And so dissociation can look as, all of us dissociate in some level, right? I feel like most of us have driven a car and then 2 minutes later you realize, oh, I've been driving this whole time and I've been not aware at all. I'm like, how am I, right? So there's still a level of functioning around that level of dissociation. There's also a level of dissociation around, right, hunger cues. We just teach ourselves not to feel those hunger cues. And so we're able to ignore it, right? We're able to disconnect from the discomfort that, oh, I have a body, right? Then there's a level of dissociation that would be very clinically significant around dissociative identity, where there's a part of ourselves that gets completely disconnected, that the other parts of us have to feel so powerless, they throw themselves into the ring. And that's what we think about around having dissociative identity, having formerly known as multiple personalities, right? That's a very, very, very severe form of dissociation. But I would say too, it's also a very understandable form of dissociation, because I've yet to meet someone with that level of dissociation who hasn't had to do that to survive, right? And so I think the less we can stigmatize it, I think the less we can clinically overanalyze what dissociation is. I think TikTok is great for many things. In some ways, for mental health, I think it's great. And for some ways, I really think it's not helpful, because I have people coming in telling me all of the diagnoses they have now. And I'm like, no, like, how do I tell you? Like, no, you saw that on TikTok and you just told me you saw it on TikTok. And I actually don't see that happening for you, right? So there's, and I think in some forms that is dissociation within itself too, right? To have to intellectualize, to have to make sense of everything, I think is a form of dissociating from the discomfort of not knowing, or from the discomfort of things just being the way they are and we're not in control of them at all times, right? So I think it's that disconnect. At the end of the day, To answer your question, dissociation is disconnection from ourselves in some way.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I love that, all of that. And I think one of the refrains I often hear, when I'm speaking with people, it just seems like people like trauma is such a dirty word sometimes. Like in some ways, it's like overused in culture now, like everything is a trauma, right? Like I missed the bus, I'm traumatized, or whatever. But on the flip side, there can almost be this resistance to accepting that somebody may have trauma, right? Like that. I mean, I've experienced this in my own life, but I can think, especially around religious trauma, and especially thinking about like queer folks who have grown up in really conservative Christian spaces or maybe other kinds of faith spaces, but who, I mean, so many conversations I have, right, involve this dissociative, like sort of like coloring to it, right? Where there is often that over intellectualization of things, right? It feels easier and safer to go into our minds than it is to feel the pain of those experiences.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that I often get feedback from my therapists, multiple therapists I've had, is like my ability to communicate a really painful experience and show no emotion about it.
Yeah.
And so, how would you define trauma for people?
The way I understand it, so I'll give you the official definition because I am a clinician still, and then I'll give you my clinical opinion of what the definition is. So trauma, according to SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the way they describe it is a series of events, or a set of circumstances that overwhelm a person's ability to cope and make sense of the event that happened to them. And I think it's really important that we have set of circumstances in there, because that leaves room for some systemic trauma, right? For those of us who are minoritized in some way, who are marginalized in some way, it's not just, I think trauma is often thought about as what happened to you. Trauma is also what didn't happen to you, but should have. And trauma is also something that was just so overwhelming and you did not have the resources to cope with it, right? There can be things that we do to ourselves that can be traumatic, right? And it's always interactive and environment. I'm a social worker, so I'm systems lens based. There's always things happening around a person, some relationship with the environment that is contributing or not contributing in some way. But I think the piece that I think is I need people to understand is it's something that happened, but it's also something that didn't happen but should have. And one of my trainers I recently got trained in somatic and attachment focused EMDR, which is a type of trauma reprocessing. And the way she framed it was, it's our nervous system remembers anything less than nurturing. And when she said that, I got chills and I was like, oh no, that means I have so much more to work through.
Right.
Not at the fault of the people around me, right? And that this happens in friendships and communities and schools and institutions and all these things. It's anything less than nurturing, our nervous system is going to respond to, because evolutionarily we're wired to take in information, remember it, and resist putting ourselves in a threatening situation again. So it makes sense, right? So I do hear this when I talk about trauma and people hear, probably the number one thing I get from my clients, especially my adult clients coming in, they're like, I don't think I have trauma. And I'm like, okay, but I advertise as a trauma therapist. What drew you to me? Right? Like I work for a place called the Nashville Center for Trauma. Like you came here for a reason, right? And so let's explore that. And people a lot of times are scared to use that word because they don't want to minimize the experiences of others, right? Those very bigger, well-known big T's of that we think of: abuse, neglect, that kind of thing, assault, that type of thing. And at the same time, if we're not able to reckon with the fact that we have things in our nervous system that were less than nurturing, that have caused us to have a negative belief about ourselves, right? Because in order to maintain connection with those things that are most important to us, we have to blame ourselves essentially, especially when we're kids, right? Kids are inherently ego driven. And what that means is kids are inherently just focused on their own world. They cannot conceptualize other minds around them and how other people understand. So when they have a stressful or horrible experience with someone who's supposed to be a caring guide, or is sometimes a caring guide, sometimes not, or they say something that is really hurtful to them and is usually great otherwise, right? What's going to happen is they're not going to be able to make sense of that. So what they do is they blame themselves. And those negative beliefs we carry with us throughout time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And essentially we're always constantly trying to prove ourselves right because of our negative bias in our cognition, that we're saying, okay, here's the negative belief I have about myself. I'm too much. That was mine. I'm being over dramatic. I'm too much. So literally every time I have a friend that looks at me funny when I start getting dancy, right? Or if I do anything, or if I wear something that's a little bit too flashy and I realize that someone's staring at me, there's a part of me sometimes that's like, take that, haha. But there's another part of me that's like, I am too much, right? And I'm proving that first belief wrong, or proving it right.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about trauma, we need to think about, it's not just, hold on, I won't get it. I have my DSM, my diagnostic manual. It's the big purple book. And
I have mine over here.
yes, it is a complicated political book that we're all trained to use in social work and counseling school. There it is. Oh, look at that beauty. That purple brings me nightmares.
Yeah.
And the thing is, our diagnostic manual does not encompass that level of trauma unless it's PTSD. And
Yeah.
PTSD was developed for veterans, right? For a very specific presentation of trauma. And there's active resistance to include other presentations of trauma in the DSM, because if we as a medical industry would be okay with that, all of a sudden all other diagnoses change and are contextualized. And then we have to change our insurance system, right? And then people would be able to access care. And so it's the systemic piece. Oh, sorry, I'm getting on my social worker pedestal right now. But
I mean, I could talk about this all day.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was just talking to a psychiatric nurse practitioner the other day, and she had just come from a trauma training. And like the trainer was talking about how, for her, she thinks that anxiety is usually a trauma response, that it's not like some isolated, you're not just like anxious, like you're anxious because of past experiences that have taught you to be anxious about X, Y, or Z, right? That there's something there, right? Something to look at.
Yeah. And to think about it under the lens of how is it adaptive? How has it been adaptive for me, right? In my perfect world, we wouldn't need diagnoses. We would say, how does this make for mental health? How does this response make sense, right? And there are some things that are biological, right? And genetic and those kind of things, and we can work with those. And I feel like the vast majority of responses that we think are socially unacceptable or not comfortable are adaptive things that we've had to go through. And especially with religious trauma. Like I know for myself, I still, even though I wish I could, I still cannot open the Bible. It does not matter where in the Bible, right? It does not matter where. I see those little numbers next to the paragraphs and I go, right?
Yeah.
And I just get so out of my ability to regulate myself. And that's something I grieve, because it is there are many parts of scripture that are beautiful. I wish I could read it. And so that's work I have to do. But it shows that it's more than church hurt, right? And I hear this pushback now that like, oh, all these millennials or whoever, they're just struggling with church hurt. Church hurt has always been here, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, sure, but there's a difference between hurt, scraping your knee, and then having someone try to rip out your heart.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so we have to reestablish, and that's work I have to do, right? That I fall outside of my window of tolerance a lot when it comes to religion, which challenges how I practice my spirituality and my faith, because there are some places that I am not yet able to go, even though I wish I could, and maybe I won't ever, right? And that's okay. And I think there's grace and there's space for that to be the case.
Absolutely. I mean, and my trauma professor, like her big thing around trauma was that it has an effect, like that there are ongoing effects in a person's life as a result of trauma. And that's one of the big keys to what makes something traumatic. You know, that two people can experience the exact same event, and one person is just a scraped knee, and the other person, you know, for years, decades.
Yeah.
And maybe it doesn't even happen right away that they feel those things, and it takes time. But at some point, they find that they can no longer sustain the level of functioning around certain things that they did before, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think, especially when we think about church, like this is, I mean, this is one of my soapboxes, like trauma informed church. How can we create that space, right? Or trauma informed religion in general. You know, like church can be one of the most harmful spaces for people. The language, I mean, I have long left my conservative, I come from a Pentecostal context, you know, like no longer there. But now I'm in, you know, the mainline church world. Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, the UCC, they love to be the liberal mainline denomination. And yet, right, so often our language can still be very damning and shaming. It can still sort of hold that. For me, like coming from the background I come from, I hear that language and I'm like, oh no, like I don't want to be here anymore. I'm ready to leave, which is challenging as a pastor, right?
I bet, yeah.
Like carry religious trauma and work in religious contexts. You know, so it's like, but I think a trauma informed lens does give us that compassion to recognize, you know what? We don't have to do this. We don't have to do it this way. We can recognize people are at different places. There's a reason people are responding. You know, one of the things that I hear so much in just everyday talk is like, I don't understand why they acted that way, right? And I don't understand. And I think like when we are trauma informed, I mean, it's not as if we have to intellectually understand, but we can understand emotionally, right? That there's probably a reason why they acted that way, even if they don't know it, right? I mean, I don't know why I act the way I do half the time. I have to sit and process and like sit with myself, right? But it's like there's reasons that I'm acting this way. And so I think just being able to make space for that and to say, I don't understand and I don't have to understand to be compassionate.
Very Henry Nouwen. That reminds me of the Henry Nouwen quote of being able to go to the places with people and not have to do anything. Just being able to go with places with people. That's what compassion is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder, so as we come to the end of our time, what does your faith look like now?
Yeah, it changes a lot. But I think the underlying consistencies that are there is that it's some form of creative medium, right? The structure of the scriptures, even though a lot of it is poetry, the way it was taught to me was not as poetry. And so poetry, honestly, is one of the author that has meant the most to me in this world is Padraig Ó Tuama, the Irish poet. He's a gay Catholic man and beautiful poet too. And I'm reading his book for like the 5th time, his memoir right now. It's on my bedside table right over there. And there's just something around, can we just be curious and playful around some of this, right? What he does so beautifully in his book is he looks at, for example, the I think it's in Luke where Jesus encounters the man that was demon possessed, and he says, "I am Legion," right? And he just plays with it so beautifully in a way that it's like, well, according to historical blah 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 blah, right? This like very cut and dry academic way of doing it. He says, "Oh, I wonder for him if Legion meant I am who has afflicted me," right? If the Legion was the empire that came crashing into his village and was taking over their way of life, for him, he may be saying, "I am who I am afflicted by," right? And that changes, right? And that may or may not be true. And I'm at a point where I'm like, I
Right.
think it's the process of this that is so much more important to me right now than what is actually underneath that all. And that's really complicated because as soon as you go into any type of, not any type, but many church spaces, they're going to be looking for, okay, but what does this mean? So that I can store it in my intellectual brain and my cognitive brain. And so I know how to move on from here. But I think there's just such beauty in being able to engage with it in different ways. And sometimes my faith life consists of just me listening to music, and not even Christian music, like regular music, secular music. And I do love that distinction between secular and Christian music. I think there's a lot of overlap there. But sometimes it just looks like that. And sometimes it looks like me playing my mandolin. And it looks a lot like me being, the way I have to push myself is me being in relationship with people and communicating about faith. That's the one place where I do hold myself accountable to say, I don't really care what conclusions I come to in this season of life around this. My commitment to myself and where I need accountability is for my friends to ask me about it, right? Because it would be easier for me to just completely disconnect. And at the same time, faith, spirituality, my spirit is just as much a part of me as the sexuality piece, right? Mm-hmm. And so I can't dissociate from the spiritual piece either, because that's also who I am. And so I need accountability in the same ways that I have accountability about other mental health stuff and physical health stuff and all these things. And so faith, is a lot more loose. And at times that gives me anxiety. And even as I was talking today with you, there are parts of me that I'm like, I'm going to listen back to this and be like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I believe that. And that's partially just because I am seeking that, comparing myself to what I used to know as well. But holding it all much more dearly now, loosely and much more dearly.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's such a powerful sort of, I think your life speaks to that, right? This sense in which you can, I mean, I think for me, I was taught that to hold something dearly was to, hold it tightly and not, don't let it go. But there is a sense in which really to hold something dearly is to recognize it for what it is and not make it what we want it to be or think it has to be.
Yeah.
But allow it to be whatever it will be.
Yeah.
I think about when God says to Moses, I am who I am, or another way to translate it is, I will be who I will be. How can you contain that being? That being will be whatever it will be. And if we allow that process to unfold, then we get to be on a journey with that process.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been a joy. It's energizing for me to kind of tap into that in a way that I haven't in a little bit. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. This was great.
Yeah. Thanks for holding space.
Absolutely.